God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me." And from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. The only God, who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. So that's the opening to John's Gospel. And have you ever read the Gospel of John in one go? You sat down and read it? You know, it's not long, is it? I mean, here is my printout of John's Gospel, single-sided, and it's not a very long read. You could easily read John's Gospel in one go. And so often, we just don't read the Bible that way. You can sit down and read a novel, read Agatha Christie, and that'll have several hundred pages perhaps, and you happily read it all in one go. You stay up all night reading it, you can't put it down. But with the Bible, we've got this habit of reading it in tiny little chunks, possibly even single verses, and trying to discern some meaning from that. And that's a risky way of reading the Bible. If you take a text out of context, what do you have? You've got a con. Actually, so often you can get confused. You read a verse and it's meaning. It's so much better to read it in context. So reading John's Gospel in context helps you to understand the individual bits. So if somebody said to you, what's a good way of getting to know Jesus? What's a good Gospel to read? You've got a choice. You've got 4 Gospels you can point them to. Why would you point them to John? What is in John that you would want to show somebody about Jesus Christ? So one of the things we're hoping to do over this series is to help you to understand John's Gospel. We've got resources where you can read John's Gospel one-to-one with a person who doesn't believe, perhaps, or is a new Christian. It's called the word one-to-one, all over the place. It's the whole of John's Gospel, and it's a nice way of introducing people to Jesus. But this sermon series is going to help you to understand John's Gospel, help to understand what it's all about. Sometimes there are things that can feel a bit complicated, so these long discussions that Jesus has with the Jews, and you think, well, what's he really saying here? Why does he say these things? So today, we're going to look at the purpose of John. We'll look a little bit about how authoritative it is reliable, why isn't it like the other Gospels? We'll look at some of the major themes and the structure. And so it will help you to get more out of reading John. So when you sit down and read John for yourself, I would advise you to print it out, and then you can go through it with a set of highlighters, and you can colour it in, like I've done. I like colouring in my Bible, but it helps you to see the patterns much better. Or you can go on Bible Gateway and you search different phrases, and then you'll see them all. That's quite interesting as well. So, the purpose of John's Gospel. So the purpose of John's Gospel we get at the end of the Gospel in chapter 20, verse 31. I'll put up here. These are written that you may believe that Jesus is Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing we may have life in his name. So that is the purpose of John's Gospel. Belief and life. So first of all, John wants us to believe who Jesus is, where he came from, what he came to do. And so the Gospel of John is all about Jesus. That's obvious, isn't it? And the Gospel declares who Jesus is, and in fact it declares it many times. So you've heard of the I Ams. When you go through the Gospel, there's like 29 statements where Jesus says, surprised actually, is in the Greek it's exactly the same construction, but we tend to focus on the 7 where there's a phrase next to it, like I am the light of the world, I am the good shepherd. But there's lots of places where Jesus says, I am. And the importance of I am is it's a declaration of divinity, it's a reference to God, who's the name of God being I am who I am, Yahweh. And when Jesus says I am, we can be fairly confident the way he's using it is he is making a declaration that he is God. The signs likewise point us to who Jesus is, and there are a set of Old Testament references which also point to who Jesus is. They testify about Christ and what the Christ is going to do. And Jesus, of course, himself repeatedly declares himself to be divine, to be God. I and the Father are one, for example. And we see it, don't we, in chapter 1, verse 18. No one has ever seen God, the only God, who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. The Gospel of John is about Jesus Christ. Who is Jesus? Is he God? The Gospel would say, yes, he is. He's God in human form. So belief. We believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. But secondly, that we should have life in the name of Jesus. So life is a major theme in the Gospel, and life is offered to everyone. So there's lots and lots of statements in John which refer to an offer for whoever, everyone who believes. So we saw one here, didn't we, in chapter 1. Where is it? Where is the phrase which refers to everyone? Anyone see it? Chapter 1. Who's got it? This is the interactive bit. The verse in chapter 1, the bit that I read, which refers to everyone, something that is offered to everyone.
The all who believe?
The life?
Come on, you're making it up. It's everyone. It's everyone. Maybe you've got it. Maybe it's translated differently.
Everyone who believes in his name.
Which one? So verse 9, the true light which enlightens everyone. Okay, the true light which enlightens everyone is coming to us. So that's an example. There's lots more. I counted over 30 statements which make an offer to everyone, whoever, anyone. And a lot of these relate to a gift of some kind. So here it's about light, everyone being enlightened. But as I think somebody mentioned, yes indeed there is that all might believe through him. There's an offer for everyone, and everyone might believe through Jesus. Verse 16, from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. This is an idea of comprehensiveness, the life which is offered to everyone. No one is excluded from the offer of life which is held out in the Gospel of John, which Jesus holds out to people. It's to everybody. And what is life? Well, it's eternal life. What is eternal life? It's that you may know God and you may know Jesus Christ. So it's about a relationship, isn't it? It's an eternal relationship with God. And in this life, it's about life in abundance, life in its fullness, Jesus describes. Life in its fullness. And it's life that overflows to other people. So he has this image of, a well which bubbles over from you to other people. So you are transformed by the life which you receive in Jesus Christ. And this is the wonderful offer in John's Gospel. So that is the point of John's Gospel. It's about believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing, you may have life in his name. And of course, there is no other way that you can have this life. It's only through believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. That's the purpose of the Gospel. Well, what about the authority of John's Gospel? So the first thing that we should note about this is that it claims to be authoritative. So chapter 21, verse 24, this is the disciple which testifies to these things and wrote these things. We know that his testimony is true. So John's Gospel claims at least to be written by an eyewitness, somebody who was with Jesus from the beginning. It's the same author of 1 John, he also describes it. We were with him from the beginning, that which we've seen from the beginning. It's a record of historical truth, right? So if we read John's Gospel, it's not some kind of fable, it's not intended to be a myth, it's not intended to be a parable. It's intended to be a description of what Jesus did, what he said, how people treated him, and what happened afterwards. And therefore, when we read it, we're reading real history, right? It's like it's an eyewitness account. It's real history. And the writer refers to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved, so the point is that he is within the inner circle. He knew what he was writing about. He wasn't just somebody on the periphery. He was somebody who spent quality time with Jesus. He understood what Jesus was saying, and Jesus invested in John to make sure that he really knew what he was doing. So we can be really confident when we read John's Gospel that we are within touching distance of Jesus Christ. This is not like some massive chain, not some kind of game of Chinese whispers, where we're reading something that has passed through multiple hands. This is straight from the person who heard and saw the things that he's writing about. And that is a remarkable document, isn't it? It's remarkable. We go back 2,000 years, and yet here we are, we're right at the source. So the same author stresses that he heard, he saw, he touched Jesus. Right? This is the Jesus that he knew. It's the Jesus that he proclaimed. Real history. Right? So it's authoritative. And that's really important, I think, particularly in the context where we are here, where so often people say, for whatever reason, oh, well, you can't really know about Jesus, can you? How do we know he did this? Well, here we've got John's Gospel. You can really know. This is the person who spent time with Jesus. He saw what Jesus did. He heard his words. He's written it down for us. And we're going straight back to the source. So yes, you can know what Jesus said and did. Well, now let's look about why the Gospel is not like the other Gospels. So if you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and you read John, you'll notice obviously that they're very different. There are some similarities between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the way it's structured, which are very different to John. Some of the episodes which are recorded elsewhere are not in John. Some of the things which are in John are not elsewhere. Why? What's going on? Why aren't they all writing the same thing? Well, John himself says that his Gospel is not a comprehensive day-by-day account, it's not a diary of the life of Jesus. So he says in chapter 20, verse 30, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. And he goes on to say, chapter 21, verse 25, Jesus did many other things. If they were all written down, I suppose the whole world could not contain the books that would be written. So there's lots and lots and lots more that Jesus did and said, which is not in the Gospel. So the Gospel is not meant to be everything we know about Jesus, right? It's meant to be everything we need to know to believe and have life. Yeah. That's the point of John's Gospel. So, somebody says to you, why doesn't it have this? Well, John didn't need to include it. He has included what you need to know to have belief and life. So it's not about spotting what he's missed out. It's not a spot the difference competition. It's looking at the Gospel and understanding, well, why did he include this? What is the inclusion of this parable or this phrase or this location, this event? Why is he written that? What is he meaning to tell us by including this phrase? And one of the things we need to realise is that John is an artist. He's not just a historian. He's not just writing down, on Monday we all got up, we went to the shops and we bought some shredded wheat. He's not writing that. He's writing very carefully. He's selecting and organising his material so that we can understand it better. Right? Because if you read somebody's journal, have you ever tried to read the diary of Samuel Pepys and discern some meaning in the life of Samuel Pepys? You will struggle. Because it's just a day-by-day account of what he did and said, and you can find all sorts of things in there which will tell you about Samuel Pepys. But John has carefully selected the material, he's organised it so that the structure and the content of everything in John's Gospel helps us to understand who Jesus is and why he came. Right? It helps us to believe and have life. So nothing in John's Gospel is random. It's not an accident. It's been carefully thought about. And part of the message is conveyed by the structure and by what is included in John's Gospel. And this helps us to understand the message. So when you read something, you should always ask yourself in John's Gospel, why has he included that? What is this telling me about Jesus? How does this help me to understand his life better? And probably you could spend a lifetime really going through John's Gospel trying to understand all of the little details. We're not going to go into that much detail in this series because we can't. There's just too much there. But it's worth you doing that. You can go through it. You can meditate on why does he include that detail. Even geographic details. There's a surprising number of geographic details that he records. Is that just he wanted to kind of say where it was? Or is there a meaning? Is there a reason why he included that? Not very often there is a meaning. Sometimes the Jewish feasts where Jesus says something or does something that's specified. So it could be the Feast of Tabernacles, right? Or it could be a Passover. Or it's not specified, it's just a feast. Why does he sometimes specify and other times he doesn't? It's not because he forgot which feast it was, it's because in some of them it's important for your understanding of the message of Jesus Christ that you understand that these things happened at the Feast of Tabernacles, for example, and that will give you a greater depth of understanding about what Jesus is saying. Now, you can read John's Gospel just on the surface level, and you can understand it perfectly well, right? But you can get more out of it by reading deeply. And the important thing to realise is none of it is random. All of it is carefully structured and included for a reason. So it's a work of art, and as with all good works of art, it's worth studying them and understanding them better. Right, well, let's think about some major themes. There are more major themes. Whoops, what's happened here? My things have gone. So there are more major themes than I've included. I've included 6. I've mentioned belief already, and that's the key thing. But if you were to go through your printout, John's Gospel, if you feel like doing it in your Bible, you can go through it with highlighters. The trouble with Bible pages, they're too thin, aren't they? So the highlighters go through. So it's good to print out on nice paper, thick paper. And you can go through, you can choose a colour, and you can highlight the word believe whenever you come across it in the Gospel. And you will see a pattern emerges as you do that. You'll see that in the first bit of John, for example, there are sections which all of them end with a statement about people believing. So you begin to realize, hang on, this is an important point. Each of these is pointing us about why people are believing in Jesus, and there is therefore something very important about the topic of belief. And you see that this carries on throughout the Gospel, that the concept of belief is there, and then suddenly you get to the purpose statement, and you realise, well, that is the whole purpose of the Gospel, is so that people can believe. That's why he's going on about belief the whole time. So the key things that people are debating in the Gospel about belief is whether Jesus is who he claims to be. Did he really come from God? Is he God in the flesh? And if so, why would God come to earth in the flesh? And these actually remain the most important questions facing mankind today. Right? Who is Jesus? Is he God? Why did God come? If that's true. And people still debate this, right? So people will still say, well, I don't believe that Jesus is God. They'll say, I don't see why God would come to earth. And some people say he can't come to earth. It's impossible. And these are exactly the same things that people were struggling with at the time of Jesus. And of course, the question for each one of us is, what do you think of Jesus Christ? That's the question that God will ask you at the last judgment. What is it you think of Jesus Christ? That is the question, right? It's not about how many good deeds did you do, how many people did you help, did you fast, did you give money away? That's not the important question. The important question, what do you think of Jesus Christ? That's the question. And that's the question that your friends are going to be asked as well. Your colleagues and everybody that you know will be asked the same question. It could be a boring judgment day, couldn't it? What do you think of Jesus Christ? You're expecting salacious details about their life. You just get that. What do you think of Jesus Christ? Now, can you explain to somebody why Jesus matters? If your friends ask you a question, why should I believe in Jesus Christ? What would you say? So John's Gospel helps you to understand that. John's Gospel will help your friends to understand why they should have a view of Jesus Christ, why they should believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and then they'll be prepared, ready to answer that question on that last day. So belief is key. The second theme which appears is truth, knowledge of the truth. And there's lots of references to people knowing or not knowing something throughout the Gospel. It's a repeat theme. It comes up all the time. I don't know, I know, we know, It appears all over the place. Knowledge of what? Well, particularly the truth. And there's a repeat reference to truth. The truth of things. We see truth in the passage that I read, it appears 3 times. True light, full of grace and truth. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So truth is an important concept, and knowing the truth, it matters to John. So much of the Gospel is all about that. So sometimes people like to pretend that truth is kind of a private conviction, right? You have your own private truth, and that's fashionable nowadays, or it was. Not sure if it still is. So people like the idea of private truth. Why is it that people like the idea of private truth? It's because nobody can tell you that you're wrong. You can just say, well, I believe But John's gospel is not about private belief, it's about belief in objective facts, belief in the truth. So he's not going around saying, well, you should have a personal private conviction that Jesus is your friend. Right? He is not saying that at all. He is saying, you need to know the truth about Jesus Christ, that Jesus is the Son of God. And by believing that Jesus is the Son of God, you will have life in his name. So you are getting a concrete consequence from your belief in the truth. So, objective truth. So do you know, for example, who is God? Do you know how God must be worshipped? And if Jesus is from God, what evidence proves that that is the case? And looking at it from the other perspective, does Jesus know you? Right? Do you have a relationship with God? And these aspects of knowledge appear throughout John's Gospel. So knowing the truth. And of course, it's not enough just to know the truth about Jesus for yourself. The third major theme in John's Gospel is about declaring it, testifying, bearing witness to the truth. So in the section that we read, it says that John came to witness, to bear witness about the light. He came to bear witness. John bore witness and cried out. And God himself, who is at the Father's side, has made God known. So these ideas about testifying, making something known, declaring it, bearing witness, this again appears throughout the Gospel of John. Nearly on every page there is some reference to bearing witness, testifying. It's important. So we testify to the truth and we enable others to know and believe in Jesus Christ. Right? That's the third major theme. The fourth major theme is to do with evidence and prejudice. So on what basis do you accept or reject Jesus? So you'll see that these are all connected in some way, aren't they? And they're all about objective truth, really, and the consequence of that. But evidence and prejudice. Why would you accept or reject Jesus? What do you base your decision on? Is it based on evidence or on prejudice? So what you know for true or what you think you know? We see this throughout John's Gospel, that there are people who reject Jesus because of what they think they know, versus the signs which Jesus is demonstrating himself. So Jesus delivers various signs, he does certain things, and he says, well, you should look at the signs and draw conclusions from these signs. So here is a man who can turn water into wine, for example. What does that mean? What does it mean that somebody turns water into wine? Look at the sign itself and draw a conclusion from it. Now, some of his interlocutors looked at this from a very superficial level, and they said, well, he's got a demon then. He did it by the power of demons. They didn't look deeper into this. And why did they say that? Because God wouldn't do these things. Why would God do these things? They weren't looking at the evidence, they just had a prejudice. They were saying, well, the Messiah won't come from Nazareth. He'll come from somewhere else, And it's interesting, at one point they say, well, the Messiah, we ought to know where he comes from. He should come from Bethlehem. And somewhere else they say, no, when the Messiah comes from, nobody will know where he comes from. So they contradict themselves as well. It's quite interesting. The point is, they're full of prejudices. And related to this is, well, what is the right way to read the Old Testament? So when Jesus turns water into wine, is he in some way fulfilling something from the Old Testament? Can you think of anything in the Old Testament related to wine flowing when the Messiah comes? Anything?
Is it in Isaiah?
Go, you look it up. I'm not going to tell you. That's your homework. Look it up. Look in the Old Testament for some research. Do some research about when God comes to his people, will there be wine? Right? When God comes to his people, will he prepare a banquet for them? Will there be, kind of bread everywhere, plenty to eat? Right? So when Jesus does these things, what is he really saying? Is he just saying, hey, I'm Paul Daniels, I can do magic? For those of you who are not the right age, Paul Daniels was a celebrated magician before magic. It's not just about that. He's making very clear and specific statements about the Old Testament. How you understand his statements also depends on how you understand the Old Testament. So fulfilling God's promises. And then sometimes people just aren't ready to accept Jesus, right? Because they're not ready to accept the truth. They're not ready to listen humbly to God. They say, no, I've got my own thoughts already. I've made up my mind. I've studied this since I was a child, and I've got my views. So they're not prepared to have their views interfered with. And that's a danger for us as human beings, because we have that tendency that once we make up our mind, we don't want to be confused by the facts anymore. That's what happens. In all sorts of areas of life, we are prejudiced people. And the danger when we discuss with our friends about Jesus Christ is, of course, they're prejudiced. Of course, they've got their own view already. And are they open to understand the truth? Well, probably no more open than we are to new ideas that we haven't accepted yet. So our prayer needs to be that people look at the evidence and they don't just approach us from a position of, well, this is what I already think. And that leads to the fifth major theme, which is our motives for rejecting Jesus. Actually, it's not really about evidence a lot of the time. It's actually really about the state of our heart. And John's Gospel exposes and challenges the motivations that people have for rejecting Jesus particularly. And one of them relates to whose glory do you seek? Do you seek God's glory or your own glory? Which do you most seek? So very often people will reject the gospel because they are afraid of their friends or their family or those around them. So we were hearing about the situation in Qatar. Why would a Qatari not accept the gospel of Jesus Christ? Well, there's many reasons. One of them is, well, people have told me it's still not true, so prejudice. Another one would be, well, the consequences are too serious. If I accept the gospel, what's going to happen about my job? What happens about my family life? And the motivation, therefore, for rejecting the gospel is fear of people and not concerning ourselves enough with the glory of God. Sometimes our motivation is not fear, though. It's wanting other people's approval and their praise. Right? So we don't accept the gospel because we think our friends will laugh at us or something. It's not really fear. It's just we want people to say, well done. You made the right choice there. And really what we should be seeking is God's glory and God's approval. Another motivation is sometimes to do with self-reliance. Right? So whether we're prepared to come humbly to God and say, look, actually I need help, or if we're completely self-reliant, I'm the one who gets to call the shots, I'm the one who says how things should be. So in John's Gospel, there are some people who are in a very vulnerable situation. There's a woman who's caught in sin, and there's a blind beggar. And in a sense, both of those are the ideal disciple, right? Because they just come seeking the mercy of Jesus Christ. It's not great to be blind, it's not great to be caught in sin, but the point is that is our condition. That is our condition. We are all caught in sin, and we are all blind, and we need God to open our eyes, and we need God to mercifully deal with our sin. And if we go around saying, well, I'm not blind, actually I see perfectly well, and I don't have any sin, I can cast as many stones as I like, that is the complete opposite of the disciple that Jesus wants. It's a terrible attitude, and it means if you have that attitude, you won't accept Jesus, because you don't need him. You can see for yourself, and you don't have any sin, so why do you need Jesus Christ? But the sad thing is, you're deluded. And as Jesus says, you think you see, but actually you're blind. You don't see at all. And so do we have an open mind or a closed mind about Jesus Christ? What do our friends think? Do they have an open mind or a closed mind? And our job as Christians is to try and open people's minds. Right? It's through carefully and politely explaining the truth of Jesus Christ, and importantly by praying for our friends that they should have their minds open, their eyes open to see, and they shouldn't be closed-minded. So, for example, when God came to work amongst his people as Jesus Christ, it turned out that he did not fit the presuppositions of the people of the time. So Jesus pointed out, for example, that he was entitled to work on the Sabbath. Right? Why was he entitled to work on the Sabbath? It's because he is God, and therefore he is entitled to work on the Sabbath because he is God. But people say, well, you can't work on the Sabbath because you're not God. And you're making yourself equal to God. Well, why did they think that? He performed all these miracles. Why did they say, well, you can't? It's a prejudice, isn't it? Saying, well, God wouldn't come amongst us. Despite the fact that God had promised to come to his people. He had promised in the Old Testament to come. So people have this closed mind. God didn't fit their preconceptions. And so often that's true of us, isn't it? We say, well, I don't see why God should do that. Or what is it that would lead God to do this? And so we start to doubt and we worry about it. And the only way we can understand this is by looking at the sixth major theme, which is that God achieves his purposes and he does it in his own time. So Jesus came to fulfill God's purposes. And when we look at the Old Testament and we carefully study it, as John has done, and so much in John's Gospel is about fulfilling what the law said. So the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Moses is pointing us towards Jesus. Abraham points us towards Jesus. All of the prophets point us towards Jesus Christ. They're pointing out the purposes of God, which Jesus came to fulfill. And throughout the Gospel, we see that Jesus works with purpose. He does nothing randomly. He is in control of events. And there's an important theme about time. The time that God set for all of these things to happen. It was not yet his time, for example. When the time was right, this is what God did. So God is completely in control. He has set out what he's going to do. He sets out his purposes, and then he achieves them in his own time. So those are some major themes. And then very briefly, let's look at the structure of John. So when we're navigating our way through John's Gospel, it's sometimes helpful to know where you are, because it's always important to see where this fits. And there's far more that can be said about this, but I think essentially there are 7 sections in John's Gospel. And the key structural markers are signs, right? They're signs. And there are 7 signs which take place in John's Gospel, and there's not one in each section. Right? The sections act as the signs act as sort of bookends, marking the beginning and the end. And there are other structural markers as well. So the first section I think is this sort of overture, which sets up the key themes. So the bit which I read to you, that is the overture. That is the key kind of mini message of John. Right? This is what he's saying. Okay, this is what I'm going to tell you, and then he goes on to tell us that, and then he says why he's told us that. So that's what he's saying. It's a nice poetic little structure, and it's nicely written, beautifully written piece of poetry almost. And then there are what appear to be kind of 6 days. So when we're introduced to some disciples, the earliest disciples, and this I think introduces us to the state of mind that accepts Jesus. And as you read through John's Gospel, you see the state of mind, for example, that Nathanael had, is not the state of mind of the Jews. So Nathanael asks the question, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Right? Can anything good come out? But that is exactly the reason why the Jewish leaders reject Jesus. They say, well, you're not from Bethlehem, and we know where you're from Galilee. So look into it. The Christ does not come from Galilee. So they're just, so it's interesting, isn't it? That Nathanael, what is it that overcomes his objection to Jesus coming from Nazareth? What is the question he's asked? Can anything good come out of Nazareth? What's the question he's asked? What do the other disciples say to him? Come and see. Come and see. So put aside your prejudices. Just have a look for yourself. Come and see what happens. See what's there. So the state of mind. So there's also other things which appear there. So properly understanding the Old Testament, seeking God's glory, accepting the testimony of God about Jesus Christ, being ready to follow Jesus. This is the hallmarks of a disciple. We see that there. And then we see how others don't fit into that. Okay, the third section, signs in Cana. So they're bracketed by signs which take place in Cana. Each scene in this section concludes with a statement about belief in Jesus, with people generally believing in Jesus, but not always for the right reasons. Okay, so that seems to be a section on its own. So the signs which Jesus carries out, and he teaches some key important truths about his ministry, how you become a Christian, what he's trying to do. So that's kind of his first ministry. And then what you could call, he came to his own, and his own did not recognize him, which is bracketed by signs on the Sabbath. He carries out signs on the Sabbath, and he is rejected because he performed works on the Sabbath. And they are described as works. And the major theme there is all about who Jesus is. Is he entitled to do these things? Who is he? Where's he from? What does the Old Testament say about him? And of course, Jesus' argument, as I've said, is that he is God, he's entitled to work on the Sabbath, and he is equal to God. He should be considered equal to God. What do you think about that? It's really remarkable, staggering claim, isn't it? And people rejected it. Many people rejected it. But were there reasons, good reasons? Does their rejection stack up against the evidence? And what does this reveal about the people who saw the signs? Well, what it shows them is that they are blind and they don't belong to God. That's the conclusion of that section. You're blind, you don't belong to God. You're not listening to the voice of the shepherd. The fifth section is all about resurrection, and it's bracketed by two resurrections, the resurrection of Lazarus and the resurrection of Jesus himself. And you can ask the question, what does the ability to raise the dead prove about Jesus Christ? But the leaders aren't prepared to engage with that. They say, well, we're going to kill Lazarus as well then, because people believe in Jesus. You see their prejudice. And throughout that section, we see that Jesus' hour arrives when he is glorified and God is glorified in him. And it becomes clear that it's through the crucifixion that we obtain this life, now in eternity, which is what the gospel is trying to hold out to us. And we have to remain in Jesus to benefit. We have the image of the vine, for example. You've got to remain in Jesus. There is no other way to life than being in Jesus Christ. And the resurrection of Jesus himself proves that we can have eternal life. It's not just a con, it is a real offer, it's a real promise to you. Then we have section 6, which is that mini section, the purpose of the book, very short, and then what I'm going to call the Great Commission. It's the section with only one sign. It's just one sign when Jesus feeds his disciples. There's this miraculous catch of fish and he feeds them. And I think that this section makes the same point as the Great Commission, which concludes Matthew's Gospel, for example. Jesus has power and authority, and he feeds his disciples, right? He is going with us and sending us out to feed and tend the sheep. That's what he commissions Peter to do, isn't he? Tend my sheep, feed my sheep. Now, what would the companion sign be? Okay, so this, in a sense, it's unfinished. So if the structure is you have a sign at the beginning and a sign at the end of the section, what would the concluding sign be that concludes this great last section? Because it's not included, and that's because it hasn't happened yet. I think probably the parallel sign is the return of Jesus Christ himself, when he comes back and he completes that work, as we've heard already today. He completes the work, and he finishes feeding his disciples, as it were. He brings them into his presence, and the work is complete. And in the meantime, we remain here proclaiming the truth about Jesus so that people may believe and have life in his name. So we're in the middle of the story. The story is not ended, we're in the middle of it. And that's our mission. So there we go, that's an overview of John. I hope you found that helpful. You can have a look at John for yourself, see why. Don't you agree with me? That's fine, you can disagree if you want, but if you do, give me some reasons. And have a look at John with your highlighter. If you go on Bible Gateway, you can print out all the chapters, you can put them all together, and you can highlight it and go through it and have a great time picking all the themes you want to look at, and then you can really study it, understand the structure and the point and everything else. So it's a good read, John, and we're going to be working our way through it, as I've said, over the months to come. But before Christmas, we'll be looking at chapter 1 in a bit more detail, and then we'll launch into it properly at the end of the start of next year. Shall we pray together? And then I think are we going to sing a song? Yeah, we're going to sing a song. Yeah. Right, Heavenly Father, we thank you for John. We thank you for his ministry, writing down the gospel to us. We thank you for his time spent with Jesus, and we thank you that you came in human flesh to reveal yourself to us, so that we can know you, we can have life through belief in Jesus Christ. And we just pray that you would make us able to share that great truth with those around us, so that they too may believe and have life. We ask it for Jesus' sake and for his glory. Amen. Amen.